The rain fell steadily over the cobblestone streets of Canterbury, washing away the faint light of dusk. Clara Whitmore stood before number 14, Thornfield Row, clutching the brass key the landlord had given her that morning. The house looked older than the others on the street. Its windows were shuttered, its bricks darkened by years of dampness and neglect. Yet, something about it had drawn her in, a quiet promise of solitude. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. The floorboards creaked under her boots as she moved through each room. The parlor still had faded wallpaper of roses, and a cracked mirror hung crookedly above the fireplace. It was a lonely house, yet oddly watchful, as though it had been waiting for her. By nightfall, she had unpacked her few belongings. A single photograph of her late husband, Henry, rested on the mantelpiece. His death at sea had left her both grief-stricken and quietly relieved, a truth she never dared to say aloud. He had been charming once, but his charm carried shadows. Secrets. The wind moaned through the chimney as she prepared for bed. Then came the first sound, soft, deliberate knocks at the front door. 3 times. Clara froze, heart pounding. She drew her shawl tighter and waited. But when she opened the door, the street was empty. Only the rain, falling harder now. She closed the door, trembling, trying to convince herself it was just the wind. But when she turned, her eyes fell on the doormat, where a piece of paper had been slipped beneath the door. The ink was blurred by water, but the words were still visible. You took what was never yours. The fire flickered violently in the hearth as if reacting to the words. Clara's hands shook as she read it again. There was no name, no sender. Only the same phrase, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. As she placed the note upon the mantel, beside Henry's photograph, she felt a chill sweep through her. The reflection in the cracked mirror above the fireplace showed her own face, and something behind her. A shadow that moved before she did. The following day brought a faint mist that lingered low over the rooftops of Thornfield Row. Clara tried to convince herself that the letter had been some cruel prank, a childish act meant to frighten a lonely widow. Yet the memory of that shadow in the mirror clung to her like a chill she could not shake off. She spent the morning scrubbing the kitchen tiles, desperate to fill the silence with the scrape of her brush. Every creak of the old house made her glance over her shoulder. When noon came, she brewed tea and sat by the parlor window, staring out at the street. The house opposite, number 17, was still boarded up. Its windows, blackened by soot, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. By late afternoon, a knock came at her door again. This time it was softer, almost polite. Clara hesitated, her heart thudding painfully. She opened the door a fraction. A man stood there, tall and thin, his coat damp with rain. His hair was streaked with grey, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Whitmore, he asked, voice low. My name is Mr. Ashton. I used to know your husband. The words struck her like a blow. My husband, she managed. Henry. He nodded once, his eyes flickering towards the house opposite. May I come in? It concerned something he left unfinished. Reluctantly, Clara stepped aside. The air seemed to grow heavier the moment he entered. Mr. Ashton removed his hat, his gaze wandering to the photograph on the mantel. He spoke of you, he said softly. Often. But there were things about Henry you might not have known. Clara's throat tightened. Such as? He looked around as though to make sure they were alone. He was involved in a matter that did not belong to him. Something of value. When he disappeared, others believed he'd hidden it. And I think someone believes you know where it is. Clara's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. That is absurd. Henry never spoke of anything like that. Mr. Ashton smiled faintly, though it was not a kind smile. Then why do you live here, Mrs. Whitmore? Of all the houses in Canterbury, why this one? The question unsettled her. She had not known what had drawn her to Thornfield Row. It had simply felt right, as though the house itself had chosen her. Before she could reply, a faint sound drifted from the hallway. 3 slow knocks, this time, from inside the house. Both of them froze. Mr. Ashton's eyes widened. "You are not alone here," he whispered. Clara turned towards the shadowed corridor. The air was still. The only sound was the slow crackle of the dying fire. When she looked back, Mr. Ashton was already at the door. "I should go," he muttered. "Lock your doors tonight. Whatever your husband began, someone intends to finish it." He stepped out into the mist before she could ask more. That night, long after the lamps were out, Clara lay awake listening. The wind brushed softly against the shutters. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps overhead, slow, deliberate, pacing across the floorboards of the room above her. But there was no one living upstairs. Clara awoke before dawn, her heart still thudding from dreams she could not recall. The memory of the footsteps above her head clung to her mind like smoke. She had not dared to go upstairs during the night, fearing what she might find, or not find at all. As the first light crept through the curtains, she rose and wrapped herself in her shawl. The house was silent now, too silent, as if holding its breath. She fetched a candle, its small flame trembling, and began to climb the narrow staircase that led to the attic. Each step groaned beneath her feet. The door at the top was swollen with damp. When she pushed it open, a gust of cold air swept out, carrying the scent of ash and mildew. Dust floated in the dim light like tiny ghosts. The attic was empty, save for an old chest in the corner, half covered by a moth-eaten blanket. Clara hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the latch. It was locked. Then, from somewhere behind her, came a faint sound, like a sigh. She spun round, the candle flickering wildly. Nothing. Only the sound of rain dripping through a crack in the roof. She turned back to the chest, and this time, she noticed something else, carved faintly into the wood, barely visible beneath the grime, were the initials HW, her husband's. Her breath caught. The lock was old and rusted, a sharp tug broke it loose. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed papers, a woman's locket, and a small wooden box bound with string. The locket opened easily. It contained a miniature portrait of a woman she did not recognize, and on the back, engraved in neat cursive, were the words, "Forgive me." Before she could examine the papers, the candle guttered. The flame struggled, then went out. Clara froze in the dark, her ears straining. For a moment there was nothing, then, faintly, a whisper drifted across the room. "Leave, before it's too late." The voice was low, almost tender, as though someone were standing right beside her. Clara stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chest. She fumbled for a match, her hands trembling so badly that it slipped from her fingers. When she finally managed to light it, the attic was empty again. But on the dusty floor, where no footprints had been before, there was now the outline of a man's boots, large, unmistakable, and facing directly toward her. Clara fled down the stairs, clutching the locket to her chest. She didn't stop until she reached the parlor, where the dying embers still glowed faintly in the hearth. She placed the locket on the table, staring at it as if it might explain itself. When she finally looked up, she realized something dreadful. The photograph of Henry that had stood upon the mantel since she moved in, was gone. Clara barely slept that night. She sat before the fading embers of the fire until the first light of morning touched the walls. The photograph was gone, vanished without a trace. No broken glass, no frame, nothing. Just the faint imprint of dust where it once stood. She tried to steady her thoughts with tea, but her hands trembled so badly she could hardly pour. Each creak of the floorboards above sent a shiver down her spine. She could almost sense the house breathing, alive, aware. By midday, she resolved to find Mr. Ashton again. Perhaps he knew more than he had said. She dressed quickly, wrapped her shawl, and stepped out into the damp, misty air of Thornfield Row. But when she reached the inn where he had said he was staying, the innkeeper frowned. "No Mr. Ashton here, miss," the woman said. "Not now, not ever. Haven't had a guest by that name for months." Clara's stomach twisted. "You're certain?" "Tall man, grey hair, dark coat." The innkeeper shook her head. "Sounds like the one from the accident, that does. Poor soul died near the river last year." Clara stepped back, her throat dry. She could hardly form words. "You mean, he's dead?" The woman nodded solemnly. "Drowned. They never found what he was carrying." Clara turned and hurried home, the mist swallowing her like a shroud. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Who, then, had stood in her parlor last evening? Who had warned her about Henry? When she reached her door, something new awaited her. A small package wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Her name was written neatly across the top, Mrs. Clara Whitmore. Inside was the missing photograph, now cracked and wet, as if it had been submerged in water. Behind the photograph was a folded note, written in the same hurried hand as before. "It was never meant for you. Leave before the 7th night." The words chilled her to the bone. She looked again at the photograph. At first glance it was the same one she had always known, Henry, standing on the deck of a ship, smiling faintly. But now, at the edge of the frame, another figure had appeared. A tall man, half-shadowed, his face turned slightly toward the camera. The face of Mr. Ashton. Clara staggered back, dropping the photograph. The frame splintered on the floor. A sharp knock echoed through the house, once, twice, 3 times. The front door rattled on its hinges, and from somewhere deep within the walls came a low, steady sound. A heartbeat. Slow. Deliberate. Alive. Then, from the hearth, came a whisper so close it might have been breathed into her ear. "You shouldn't have opened the chest." The old pendulum clock in the hallway struck 12, its chime echoing through the empty corridors like a funeral bell. Margaret had been unable to sleep since the afternoon's revelation. The idea that Henry Ashford might have lived within these walls, that he could still linger somehow, gnawed at her. Clutching a candle holder, she descended the staircase in her nightdress, its lace hem brushing against the polished banister. The shadows seemed to move with her, whispering just beyond hearing. She reached the library, where the scent of old leather and smoke hung thick in the air. The room appeared unchanged, yet Margaret noticed something she hadn't before. One of the shelves, the one nearest the portrait, was pushed slightly forward, its base uneven with the others. Her heartbeat quickened. She set the candle down and tugged gently at the edge. With a low creak, the shelf moved, revealing a narrow passageway behind it. The air that spilled out was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of salt and stone. Margaret hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. Her candle flickered violently as she advanced down a short, curving tunnel. At the end, a small wooden door waited, barely visible beneath layers of dust. When she pushed it open, she found herself in a forgotten chamber, part cellar, part study. There were stacks of yellowed papers, old nautical charts, and a chest bound with rusted metal. On the desk, a journal lay open, its ink faded but legible. She bent closer to read. January 3rd. The sea has claimed another. But I cannot leave her. Not yet. Her breath caught. The signature at the bottom read H. Ashford. Margaret barely had time to process the words before she heard it, a sound like footsteps above her, slow and deliberate. Someone else was awake. She extinguished her candle, plunging the chamber into darkness. And then, from the tunnel behind her, came the faint flicker of another light, a lantern swinging slowly, drawing closer. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall. The faint light grew stronger, stretching long, trembling shadows across the floor of the secret chamber. Whoever it was, they knew the passage. This wasn't a discovery, it was a return. The footsteps stopped at the threshold. For a moment, there was silence, save for the drip of water from the ceiling. Then the lantern lifted, casting a weak golden glow across the walls. "Who's there?" a man's voice called softly, hoarse and uncertain. Margaret hesitated, then stepped forward slowly. "I could ask the same of you," she said, her voice trembling. The man turned. He was middle-aged, with streaks of grey in his hair and salt stains on his coat, as though he had just come from the sea. His face, when it caught the light, bore a haunting familiarity, the same sharp features she had seen in the portrait upstairs. "You look as if you've seen a ghost," he said quietly. "Perhaps I have," Margaret whispered. "Who are you?" He lowered the lantern, eyes fixed on the journal she held. "That belongs to me." Margaret's fingers tightened around the worn leather. "Henry Ashford." The man gave a faint smile, weary, almost broken. "What's left of him?" Her breath caught. "But, you died." "The records, the grave." "Lies," he interrupted. "For her protection." "For mine." He glanced toward the tunnel as though listening for something. "I've been waiting for someone to find this place. I thought it would be her, but she never came." Margaret tried to steady her voice. "Who?" "Eleanor." The name trembled on his lips. "She was meant to run with me that night. We planned everything. But the sea turned, and she vanished before dawn. They said she drowned, but I've never found her." A shiver ran down Margaret's spine. "You mean your wife?" He shook his head slowly. "Not my wife. My love." The words hung heavy in the damp air. And as they did, Margaret realized, the portrait above the mantel wasn't of Henry Ashford at all. It was of Eleanor. The silence between them broke with a sound from above, the unmistakable groan of footsteps on the library floorboards. Someone else was now in the house. Henry's eyes hardened. "You need to leave. They mustn't find you down here." "But who?" Before she could finish, the lantern blew out, and the chamber was swallowed in darkness once again. Margaret stumbled through the dark, one hand brushing the cold wall, the other clutching the journal tight against her chest. The air in the tunnel grew heavier, laced with the faint scent of smoke, or was it burning wood? Somewhere above, she could still hear the slow creak of footsteps moving across the library floor. When she finally reached the small stairway leading back to the surface, a sliver of light shone through the cracks in the floorboards. She hesitated, straining to listen. The footsteps had stopped. Carefully, she pushed the panel aside and emerged behind the bookshelf. The library was still, except for the flicker of the dying fire in the grate. The shadows seemed deeper now, stretching unnaturally long across the room. Then she saw it, a man standing by the window, back turned to her. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his posture was tense, as though listening. Margaret froze. Her voice trembled. "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" The man turned slowly. His face was unfamiliar, pale, angular, with eyes that glimmered strangely in the firelight. "Your house," he said in a quiet, measured tone. "No, Mrs. Ellis. This isn't your house." "Not truly." Her throat tightened. "You've got no right to be here. Leave, or I'll call the police." He smiled faintly. "You could. But they wouldn't believe you. Not after what's written in that book you're holding." Margaret's heart stopped. The journal. He knew about it. "How do you know about this?" she demanded. "Because I wrote it," he said softly. "Or at least, part of it. My name is not Henry Ashford. It never was." The words hit her like a blow. "What do you mean?" "I met him, down there." The man stepped closer, his voice low, almost coaxing. Whatever you saw in that tunnel was not him. It was what remains when guilt refuses to die. That house, that light, they feed on regret. And now, they've chosen you. Margaret backed away, shaking her head. You're mad. Am I? He whispered. Then tell me, Mrs. Ellis, when was the last time you saw your husband's reflection in the mirror? She froze, staring at him. He tilted his head. You haven't, have you? Because he's been here all along, in the walls, in the light, in the name that isn't his. Robert Ellis died in that fire 20 years ago. Margaret's breath caught, her vision blurring. No. That's not true. Oh, but it is, he murmured. And the light across the lane. It's calling for you next. A sudden gust swept through the room, extinguishing the fire with a hiss. The man was gone, as though he'd never been there. In the silence that followed, the faint glow from across the street began to pulse again, brighter than ever, flickering through the curtains like a heartbeat. Margaret sank to her knees, the journal slipping from her hands. The last page fluttered open on its own, and in her husband's handwriting were the words, "Forgive me, before the light takes you too." Margaret's hands shook as she clutched the journal. The pulsing light from number 17 was brighter than ever, filling the room with an almost tangible presence. She felt drawn to it, as if some invisible thread tugged at her very being. For hours she sat in the dark, listening to the house creak and sigh around her, reading through Henry's final notes. He wrote of Eleanor, of a love lost to the sea, and of a secret he had never revealed, a secret hidden in the very foundations of the house opposite. By midnight, she could no longer resist. She wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped out into the chill night air. Mist curled around the street lamps, and the glow of number 17 flickered like a heartbeat. Margaret's every step seemed to echo loudly, yet the street was empty. When she reached the gates of the abandoned house, the air changed, warmer, heavy with salt and smoke. She pushed open the rusted gate and approached the front door. The pulsing light now streamed from the cracks in the boarded windows, inviting her inside. Margaret's heart pounded as she lifted a loose board to step through. The interior smelled of fire, damp wood, and something else, something familiar yet foreign. At the center of the main room, an old mirror hung on the wall, strangely pristine. She approached it, and in its reflection, she did not see herself. She saw Henry, or what remained of him, standing behind a woman she now recognized as Eleanor. Their hands were intertwined, faces serene despite the passage of years. The light seemed to emanate from them, warm and inviting, almost like forgiveness. Margaret's lips trembled as she whispered, "I forgive you, Henry. I forgive you both." The glow intensified, and for a moment, she felt weightless. Then the figures in the mirror began to fade, the light softening until it disappeared completely. She blinked and found herself alone in the quiet, cold room, the only sound her own steady breathing. The mystery had been laid to rest, though not in the way she had expected. The house, the light, the journal, all remnants of love, regret, and secrets long kept. Margaret stepped out into the early dawn, the mist clearing. Across Ashford Lane, number 17 was dark once more, silent as it had been for decades. She felt a strange sense of peace. Though the past had been filled with shadows and uncertainty, she had faced it. And in doing so, she had finally found closure.